Hello, everyone. So today we are here with Caitlin Grisak, who I met recently during a saddle fitting appointment. Well, I guess technically we met prior to a saddle fitting
Yes.
appointment. And were introduced by a gal at your barn, which I was so grateful for because as soon as
Me
we
too.
started talking, I was like, oh, your story. What I got out of it that day was such a familiar story, like such a story that I hear time and time again of people struggling with saddle fitters and struggling with saddles and trying to find something that works and really getting nowhere fast. And we quickly moved into countless other conversations both that night and when I came back for your saddle fitting that I was like, holy cow, this on the one hand is like the most unique story I've ever heard. So how you came to have your horse, Regalo, and his story prior to coming to you. And then the journey that you've had since then has been really unique and also something that I'm seeing more and more as people end up with horses that have maybe some trauma or some things in their history where they really call out in us something more and they demand more of us in that they're not just going to kind of fall into line with traditional training practices and get better with more training and thrive in the standard environments. And so it was
Yeah.
fascinating to hear. And the reason that I wanted to have Caitlin on today was I felt like your story is so inspirational to other riders and people who maybe are struggling with their horses and are having to take some new and nuanced approaches to the training with their horses. So, thank you, Caitlin, for agreeing to come on the podcast. And I feel like everybody is going to love this conversation. I have absolutely adored getting to know you and talking to you and digging into
Oh, thank you. Me too.
some really in-depth
Me too.
concepts, of the human psyche as well as how we relate to animals. And we're going to be digging into all kinds of interesting stuff today. And so sorry about that. So, I would love if you could share a little bit of your story with Regalo and breaking cycles and building trust and redefining doing the right thing as it applies to
Mm,
your individual horse.
yeah. And just wanted to say I so appreciate you having me on your podcast. And I think just since I met you, Katrina, I think we just kind of hit it off.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I think we can't underappreciate the importance of support with our horses and in the equestrian community. And so coming on this podcast and sharing a little bit about my struggles and Regalo's struggles as well as our success stories. And we don't have it all sorted out yet, but I think meeting really good practitioners and folks like yourself really can be a make or break on how we start to feel about the situation and how our horses start to feel about the situation of being in partnership on a ridden journey. So just was excited to spend more time talking and because we always have a blast and also
Absolutely.
just to talk about some of the nitty gritty of maybe
Mhm.
what I've learned or what I've had to unlearn and if it
Yeah.
can help anyone just to let them know there's other folks maybe that are also struggling sometimes or have some pieces that are difficult or
Yeah.
with their horses and that's okay and then I feel like that's a message that would have helped me like I get that a bit but I think a bit more of that messaging would have maybe helped me sooner to make some of the changes that I found have been helpful in my horse's well-being. So I think it's a worthwhile conversation to just leave it a little bit more open.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, I think what you guys have been through is reflective of what I see so many people going through for so many reasons, and really kind of was near and dear to my heart because I had a mare named Ellie who I had sort of talked about in my intro episode, and she came to me with a fair bit of trauma, physical, mental, emotional, and she was a very sensitive mare. And, she was a horse that also did not respond super well to a lot of the standard training practices. And she did not respond terribly well to the way I was taught to approach things. And even though I'd
Mm,
already been on a learning journey at that point and was trying to better my horsemanship and better myself, it was like, holy cow, there's so much I don't know here. And this mare is not accepting of that. She's just like, no, you need to show up better, lady. Like, if you want this to work, if you want something from me, you got to tell me what
yeah,
you're giving to me. And
yeah,
she called out so much and called up so much in me that
yeah.
was really required in terms of my personal growth to have the relationship with her that I wound up having.
So
I
beautiful.
see that come time and time again with other clients and their horses and the journeys that they're having. And so
Yeah.
often comes from a horse that's really a bit sensitive and has had a bit of an interesting past. So I would love if you could
Mm,
tell everyone here the story of Regalo and how you came to have him and what his kind of history was, because I think that's something that, like, I'd
yeah,
never heard a story like that before for a horse, and it was like, "Holy cow, this guy has got some things that are
yeah,
really nuanced and really impacting the way he's showing up, but also then determining a little bit how we need to show up in partnership with him," right? Whether it's
yeah.
myself for an appointment, any trainers who you might have working with him, or for yourself, right?
Yeah, no, you're so right. Yeah, so I mean the story of Regalo, it's so interesting because before I got him, I had actually recently lost a mare that I'd had for a number of years who was also very sensitive and had a complex history of trauma, and she really called me forward too. I needed to learn a totally different and new way of working with horses in order to support her mentally, but also to support her physicality and to be comfortable in her body. And yeah, she was often described as, she's a lot. Or I
Mm.
had someone else tell me that she was really polarizing as a personality type.
Mhm.
And she was a really incredible horse in that I learned so much from her. I think I consider her to be one of my biggest teachers to date. After I, unexpectedly and kind of suddenly lost her, when I started to think again about what would be my next horse, I wanted to I wanted to get a horse with a story. I wanted a
Mhm.
horse with a story, and I wanted to honor her and kind of carry some of that learning that she gifted me forward.
Mm.
Maybe into another horse. With some unique considerations as well.
Mhm. I love
So
that.
and so she was a Frisian mare, and so I didn't want another Frisian just because of all of the complexities and the health considerations, which I had found to be quite heartbreaking. So I really wanted an Iberian horse. And I had gotten really into classical dressage. I was very interested in doing working equitation.
Mm.
The Iberian horses I met all were really personable and expressive and kind. That social dynamic is really important to me, and the partnership with the horse is really important. So, in my ideal world, I was like, I'd love to my next horse to be an Iberian with a story. But,
Mhm.
I didn't necessarily know that's what was gonna happen. But, if someone asked me, "What do you want? What are you looking for?"
Yeah.
I think often people are like, "Well, what do you want the horse already to do?" Or what do you want it to be
Mhm.
trained in? And I realized that I didn't really have, um that wasn't that important to me. It was really more about the individual horse itself and just kind of
Mm.
knowing when you've met them that that's a relationship that you wanna take on. I'd mentioned to you that the story of Regalo started in Morocco,
Yes.
and it did start in I think it did start in Morocco because, I had gone on, I'd taken myself on a riding holiday when I was in my, kind of my grief of not having my horse and not wanting to and not really feeling that motivated to ride locally.
Mm.
Um, I had lots of incredible, like, friends and people at my barn that offered, their horses to me to ride and to interact with, but I just didn't I wasn't feeling called to those connections, right? It's sorta like losing your best friend and someone's like, "Hey, I have a best friend. Do you wanna hang out with my best friend?" And you're like,
Yes.
"Not really,
No.
like,
We
I'm
don't.
sure I'm sure they're great, but, like,
Yeah.
that doesn't help me." Really? So, um I went on a trip to Morocco to go riding through the desert along the coast in Astoria. And that's maybe a longer story, for another day.
Yeah,
But
I know, I'd love to hear about
because
that.
I have some incredible stories from that trip. But I maybe what's important to know is that I ended up riding a young Barb stallion there for these long endurance rides. He was 4 years old. His name was Ocean, and he was this sort of roan slash more like rose gray colored horse. And I didn't want to ride him at all when I got there. I'd had
Mm.
another horse. I'd seen this horse misbehave, and I wanted nothing to do with this horse. And had told the rather incredible woman who was running all of this about why I didn't want to ride this horse, because you're on these long rides, you are galloping for hours and hours and hours. I had never gone so fast on a horse in my life, and it was exhilarating and incredible.
No
Um, but
kidding, that's
but
so
you
cool.
but you're in the middle of nowhere, and you couldn't bring the horse back. You were on a multi-day road trip with this horse. So
Right.
if it didn't work, and I was there to have a good time. I didn't really want to train a
Yeah,
young
train a
horse.
4-year-old stallion?
Yeah, and so
Weird.
I was really resistant to this idea. I will just offer that I really was, and she ended up being really reassuring and also just giving me no choice. So so we embarked on that, and we had lots of good adventures together. But where we ended up was I
Mhm.
like had fallen in love with this horse by the end of this trip.
Aw.
I had spent a week with him straight, and I just thought he was the best thing. He had this really warm personality, and he was really playful, and he tried really hard, and he gave me a really safe, secure feeling. In fact,
Mhm.
all the stallions I rode there that I don't normally have exposure to gave me this really safe, secure feeling, and really
Mhm.
started to change also my mindset on what that looks like. To have these more hotter breeds,
Mhm.
have these intact animals, and what mentality they're bringing and what that looks like. So
Mhm.
it was a really good learning experience for me there. But so I quite loved this horse. I, kind of left my heart with him a little bit in Morocco. I came home and I started horse hunting again, and hadn't really changed my mindset a ton, but was just kind of open. And I was looking online like we do. And I
Yes.
was on, some horse finder website, and I hadn't changed the settings on like a location that, was near to me. And so up pops this, up pops Regalo. And I was kind of floored because he looked exactly the same as this horse, Ocean, that I had fallen in love with in Morocco. He had the same, really similar face, and I actually had sent a photo of this horse that I found online back to Astoria, back to the folks I was riding with, and I was like, "Oh my gosh,
Oh.
this horse looks the same." And they thought it was the same horse at first. Like there was so much similarity that they were sort of like, "Where did you get this photo of him?" And like there was an uncanny likeness.
Mhm.
Um, but I will offer that like this the ad for Regalo really only had his face. Like there wasn't a lot
Okay.
of other information in it,
But he has a very handsome
but
face.
he has a very handsome face. So, at this point in time I'd, done lots of like hunting and looking into, and things kind of fell through pretty consistently, or
Mm.
lots of finding out the horse has an incredible amount of maintenance or other things, or barriers to just having them live in the environment I was looking to have them live in wasn't going to fit.
Yeah.
um but so with Regalo, I spent some time talking to the trainer that had first started him and found out more about his background. And Regalo had been rescued as part of an animal welfare seizure in the
Mm.
States, and it was actually part of a drug cartel bust. And they didn't realize there was animals that were on the property when they
Mm.
showed up to grab the stolen farm equipment and Lamborghinis and other things that we were there to seize. And there was 9 Iberian stallions that were kept inside in a barn that they couldn't see when they were doing
Mhm.
surveillance, and they were all in fairly horrific condition. So I saw photos that were shared with me later, and they were kind of just hanging on. They were
Mm.
wildly skinny and overgrown feet, and their hair was falling out, and they were really really rough. And in
Mhm.
fact, a few of them were put down on the spot, and the other ones were brought
Mhm.
into an animal rehabilitation center to be held. And so Regalo was one of those stallions. He was the youngest on the property, and he was one of the only ones that wasn't in the barn, and they didn't really know why, but he was outside in a round pen, isolated at the back of the property, and was a few 100 pounds underweight, but wasn't as bad as the other horses. And they said when they pulled him, he didn't really know anything from what they could determine, but that he was kind. And from there, the animals were held for a while the court case was going on, and he eventually found a home with a lovely couple who actually he had a background in law enforcement and was aware of this and had previous exposure to, and we talked quite a bit about that because I've worked in that space also in the past, and I after quite a few conversations with the trainer who initially started this horse, I drove out kind of to the middle of nowhere and met this lovely couple and went on about like a 4-hour trail ride, through their
Oh my
incredible
gosh.
property. And he was not a horse that was actively under saddle at the time, but he was he was not normally something I would do unless the vibes were good. But I talked
Mhm.
to the trainer and I round penned him first a little bit just to see how he was from the ground and at liberty. And he carried me through gusting winds, cliff edges,
Oh my
deer running
goodness.
about. And I thought, oh my gosh, if this horse is this good with everything he's
Yeah.
been through, and with the very minimal amount of training that he had 30, days, and then he sat for almost a year. I thought this horse already is something special, but
Mm.
this guy's gonna be really incredible.
Yeah.
So,
Ugh.
I think at that point in time, I'd already made up my mind that if he cleared from a health standpoint, I would take him home with me. And
Wow,
that's what ended up happening,
that's amazing.
which is all quite romantic. But,
Well, it's just like it's such a wild story, there's so many pieces to it, and, really, like, coming from the background that he did, and you coming from the experience that you just had in Morocco, which I am only hearing for the first time today, so I'm really, like,
yeah.
glad
I was like, "I
that you
don't
gave
wanna
that.
take up too much time on that," but I mean, it's so much I could say. Yeah.
I bet. Yeah, I would love to like hear how that whole experience was.
Another
And,
day.
I feel like we've already talked about doing multiple episodes because we have so many things to talk about. It's yeah, it sounds like it was just an amazing opportunity. And
Yeah.
so you've had Regalo for a year now. Is
Yeah,
that
that's
right?
right.
And how long had he been with this couple prior to coming to you and after the
Um,
seizure?
yeah, a little bit over a year. So he went to them with a training contract, from, the
Okay.
animal welfare organization, the rescue, and so the horses were then adopted out, the ones that had recovered and done well, and they needed to go to, professional training
Okay.
because they did
Makes sense.
not know, some of them were very, didn't know very much at all. Others had been quite well trained. I did eventually learn that all the other horses on the property, were fully registered pre's that had like all their information they were able to sort of locate after the fact. They knew who they were, but they
Yeah.
didn't really know who Regalo was, or where he came from. So they did a DNA test on him to find out that he was Lusitano with, some Andalusian in there as probability. And, he was gelded after he was strong enough to be gelded after being
Mhm.
rescued. So they think he was about 6, maybe 7 when
Okay.
that happened. But so he was, kind of gelded, had his wolf teeth removed, figured out how to be led on a lead line and do some
Mhm.
basic things, and then went off to a trainer to be started who works with Mustangs in the States. and I was able to see some of the video, of the first starts and the first rides actually, which was very cool to see.
Oh, that's
Um,
amazing.
yeah, so because he'd filmed those and he shared them with me. So that also gave me like a bit more of a peace of mind and
Mhm.
I talked to this trainer for, hours honestly, because the first step was to talk to this trainer, and if the
Mhm.
trainer they were kind of the first step, and if you could get through the trainer, then you could meet the horse.
Okay. Yeah.
Because, of course with the background, they
Yeah.
were fearful he'd fall into bad hands again. He was really didn't like men. When I met him, he was, took a long time to build trust with men. If you moved quickly around him, hands near his face, being brushed, having anything in his mouth, anything with feet, he was incredibly reactive. So, he had obviously had some experiences in his life that had, you know, let led him to those behaviors and that experience of
Mhm.
being with people. So yeah, and the fact though that he was still so kind, to me, a horse that was still so kind, having obviously gone through so much, was,
Mhm.
like, really got my heart, you know? I was just
Yeah.
like, "Oh, like, how can you not?" But, that being said, as I'm sure probably people can guess, it's not smooth sailing,
Yeah.
with that.
Yes, and we'll get into some of those complexities.
Yeah,
And a big part of what struck me is not just that I hear this story a lot, like across the board with clients, but I see it a lot with people in their PREs because they tend to be just a breed that we're not, or breeds that we're not as familiar yet with working with. And they
for
tend to
sure.
be very athletic, very forward thinking, very quick. And with those qualities comes some other challenging attributes that, again, call out more in us and,
Yes.
really require us to approach things a little differently, approach things as a conversation.
Mhm.
When you have a horse that is kind of driven on their own and kind of has, and not that there aren't other breeds that can have this, but I would say the PRE horses are so much more forward thinking than a lot of other breeds that you meet, and they
Yeah,
are really bred with a job in mind, and you can
yeah,
really see the influence of genetics so much more strongly there than in, say, oh, we have a warm blood. Well, that could be anything from a 15-1 short couple bum high horse to a 17-2 uphill chunk and everything in between, something that's really dull and lazy. And not to say you don't have some variations in the PREs, but
yeah,
in general, the breed characteristics are a little less diluted at this stage of the game
yeah,
and just a little bit truer to kind of the origins of the breed and what breeds and what they're being used for. And so that has a lot of complexity, like working with the personality and the mentality and physicality,
yeah,
because one of the things that we discussed and that I see so often, one of the challenges is like they're extremely prone to atrophy in their longissimus dorsi muscles. And we
yeah,
see a lot of soft tissue remodeling happening quite quickly in the PRE horse as a result of a number of things. They tend to carry more tension. They tend to carry themselves really uphill. A lot of horses when they round, they might round from the base of the wither and lift through the mid back, whereas they tend to elevate and sit down.
oh,
So it
yeah,
can make them more prone to pressure at the back of the panels. It can also make it harder for a rider to stay feeling in balance. A lot of them are really short coupled and quite broad. They tend to have big movement. So big movement on a short coupled horse can
yeah,
create more movement in the saddle, which can create more friction and pressure and things like that. So, when
yeah,
we met, you had mentioned you'd been struggling with some saddle issues, of course, which is why I was there. But I'd love to
yes,
hear a little bit more about the struggles that you were having, the experience that you'd had with that, and
mhm,
some of the other pieces that made your journey with him kind of go in the direction of us meeting.
yeah, for sure. It's yeah, the movement is really incredible,
Yeah.
horses that can go sideways and backwards and forwards all at the same speed, which is fast. You know, it's quite incredible, and comes with its challenges, of course. And that was one of the reasons why he was looking for a new home in the first place, was that
Mm.
that movement, and coupled with some health concerns of his owner,
Mhm.
did not feel like a good fit anymore. So, and and some days I'm sitting there thinking, "Holy heck, this is a hard fit. This is a lot." And what I think what's really interesting with the riding piece with him is that I did ride him before I got him, but he's always been much more tense in arenas than in on a trail or out and about.
Mhm.
So arenas were already a very challenging place to bring him. And we'd have a ton of tension and we'd come in and he would just thunder around.
Okay.
And almost kind of you felt like you almost got kind of lost him. Same thing, if you bring him into a working, round pen that he's not used to, or really
Mhm.
any arena space where the pressure goes up, using whips with him, things like that wasn't gonna ever be possible. I think a lot of horses carry whip trauma. And so riding him was actually when he calmed down and we were able to work on our relationship a bit
Mhm.
more. Um, and he came to me quite overweight, even though he was quite skinny at one point in his life. He gained a lot of weight. So when I bought him, he had a body score. He said if he was gonna go conservative, an 8 out of 9. And so he was rotund little guy, um, with, who was really wide and had a really curvy
Mhm.
back. And so, um, you know, getting him in a saddle that worked.
Mhm.
And then while we're doing work and adjusting diet and having him lose weight and build muscle, I was out of saddles pretty regularly,
Mhm.
especially ones that didn't have a lot of adjustability.
Yeah.
But also a saddle that didn't have a lot of structure to it at times didn't feel like the best option for me, given his propensity for big movement and high
Mhm.
reactivity. So
Yeah.
on a trail or out and about, that's fine. But as soon as we are coming in the arena and we're starting to work through some of the tension or to do some different pieces, I felt, well, for both of us, we needed a saddle that fit both of us. And I would say
Mhm.
when we first started trying to fit, it was so challenging with different fitters and with how quickly his body was changing, and then just needing to get someone back out to readjust the saddle for me, and sometimes a full reflock, or
Mhm.
we were always widening a ton and making adjustments. There was a whole bunch of periods of time where I didn't have a saddle that fit him. Like last
Yeah.
winter, for I'd sent a saddle out to be redone, and it took longer than expected, and I ended up being without a saddle for 4 months. And,
Yeah.
you're kind of cobbling together other solutions, but when you also have a really sensitive horse, um,
Mhm.
who doesn't have a strong back, and part of that is helping um, you know, to encourage him to relax and supple and move in a way, where he can lift his back, 'cause he is a hypermobile horse, but has a
Yes.
tendency to have tension, as you've seen, and just sort of,
Mhm.
invert and get on the forehand and just, careen forward with his head in the sky.
Mhm.
And so I was also trying to balance that tension of not wanting to ride, obviously, in an ill-fitting saddle,
Yeah.
highly sensitive horse, and have riding not be a comfortable experience for him, especially because he seemed to be much more relaxed under saddle than he was, say, with groundwork, or being like he couldn't lunge on a line when I first met him and things like that. So, and like Liberty like, there's just a lot of other things that were challenging that he needed to learn, right? So, it
Yeah.
was like I didn't want to kind of take the one thing that was a bit more relaxed
Yeah.
and dislodge that, because that felt like he'd also had a really good start, I thought, with the initial trainer, who
Mhm.
was really kind and gentle, and I think inspired a lot of confidence in him.
Mhm.
Um so I didn't wanna undo any of that, but it not having a saddle that fit, and
Yeah.
having so many people tell me, "Oh, he's gonna be custom, and he needs an extra wide and pony panels and a ton of curve," and, you know, and you're a larger, you're a rider who I'm 5'8" and I have a very long leg. So even though he has a big barrel, I can't easily be in a 16-inch seat. Although I did spend quite a bit of time riding in those if that was the only thing that fit him, but that ultimately wasn't, a good fit for both of us and wasn't very, I would just say very like confidence inspiring because I wasn't in the right position.
Yeah.
And, I think, yeah, especially with like a classical dressage background, like we were very,
Yeah.
we're quite strict on some of those pieces.
Mhm.
So that was really challenging, and still is really challenging at times because as you mentioned, the movement is often different. So if you're a little bit back or a little bit forward, you're not right in that kind of sweet spot, you're going to get left behind the
Yeah.
motion pretty quick.
Yeah. And when you've
Yeah.
got a short coupled fast moving horse, critical that we're in their balance point and that we're balanced in their balance point, because like when everything's happening with very little margin for error,
Yeah.
it doesn't take a lot on either side of that imbalance to create a massive issue. And,
Yeah.
and to create confidence problems for both us and them, especially when things are kind of new and we're trying to build a solid foundation. And so, in that, like, I know we talked about the fact that you sort of had to go against the grain quite a bit. And, that's something that we end up focusing on a fair bit in this podcast.
Yeah.
Because I am a bit of an against the grain thinker. And, even as soon as we met, I remember like I walk in and I'm kind of playing with him, and he's a pretty oral guy.
Yeah.
And, I was tickling his nose and playing with him, and I remember you mentioning like, "Oh, I can't remember how you said it, but if you don't want him to do that, just let me know," or something, and I was like, "No, I wanna engage with him where he's at. I wanna do something that makes him feel comfortable. I want to let him know that, like, I'm here for him, and it's not gonna be a session where it's like, 'You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do this,' but more of a session where we empower him to know, like, we are here for his good, and that's gonna involve a lot of different things, if we're like, "Oh, we can't stand right now because 'cause we're too stimulated," we're gonna do what we can to either bring the stimulation level down or give him an outlet for the stimulation, you know, be a little atypical maybe in the way we would approach it, and it kind of opened up a whole bunch of conversations for us around
Yeah.
how you've had to maybe go against the norm in the industry, like say in the classical dressage world or just in most barns of what people are doing with their horses. So I'd love to hear, a little bit more about that and like the feedback that you came up against with, whether it was trainers or other people in the barn, that sort of thing. Because this is something that I see so many people struggling with. And you were just such a shining example of like somebody
Oh,
who
that's kind.
yeah, well, and it's true because as we've talked about, like it's not easy to go against the grain in the horse industry by any means.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of shaming practices. So, for the audience, I'm going to share a podcast that Warwick Schiller just released. And it's really, he digs into a lot of shame practices and a lot of how shame is utilized to domesticate us. And that's sort of the term that they talk about quite a bit. Caitlin and I were like, "Oh, this is totally something we see happening when you're the only one at the barn maybe doing liberty work, or you're the only one at the barn taking your horse for walks, and you're the only one at the barn who maybe isn't spending every day riding, but instead you're actively approaching other aspects of your horse's mental, emotional, and physical well-being in a way that maybe isn't so familiar to them," and how people make lots of comments about that and are very quick to judge anyone who's doing things a little differently. So yeah, I
Yeah.
would love to kind of hear how that journey looked for you, Caitlin. And hopefully that can kind of help to inspire anybody who's, had a similar situation.
Yeah, and I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate how open you were also in the moment. There's some folks that have zero tolerance for a mouthy horse,
Mhm.
right? And are really strict. And I I'm not sitting here advocating for that at this point in time, but more just recognizing that, yeah, the horse explores the world often through its mouth. And,
Mhm.
what does that mean for building relationship? Also, especially building relationship with some of these, horses who maybe have a big stranger danger.
Yeah.
So, right, like he had
Mm.
a really huge stranger danger when I met him. You try and bring him like a cookie or an apple or a treat, anything unknown, he would sniff it, but you'd have to coax him forward. Like it was, I think at first, like, you know, he just, he wasn't sure. And when he also
Mhm.
isn't sure, he's also often very quiet. And when he's really feeling good and feeling himself, he can be quite boisterous and, has a bit of like a puppy dog personality, right, that we would
Yeah.
describe, but we often like the quiet, it's very unproblematic, and I will say that also having a horse that's out of shape and, isn't being ridden in hot weather is very different than having a now in shape horse who knows that you're gonna maybe listen to him when he says no, or
Mhm.
ask him or have more of a dialogue in really cold weather. So, just
Mhm.
they're not always the same and neither are we, and, that
Yeah.
turned up the drill. But I remember one thing I was first told with the saddle fitting was because his top line was so poor and his back was so curvy, it would be so hard to find anything that could fit him. So what
Mhm.
I should spend some time focusing on is a lot of groundwork so he can build up some top line and then we can try fitting a saddle again, which I don't think is poor advice. And we need to do tummy tucks and we need to engage his core and, maybe I need to think about taking him for a walk, and some of these things and all really helpful, well-meaning advice, and this was a horse already I was, walking at times, an hour or 2 hours a day, for
Mhm.
that reason of, I knew he was very out of shape and I knew he didn't
Mhm.
have muscle and I knew that he became barn and buddy sour historically. Getting him out in his environment and going by himself and
Yeah.
moving together, him and I, for hours at a time, was something that we did regularly. But absolutely, I got a lot of really silly looks, which was, I thought you said he was broke to ride. Why are you not riding?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm having problems with saddle fit. Also, I've uncovered because really he had very little training in the first place and then
Yeah.
sat all of these other issues, like he pulls back and he can't stand in cross ties and it is an argument to brush him because he's so
Mm.
sensitive to touch anywhere and you can't bridle him and he doesn't like a bit in his mouth and there's so many other things to work on that I was like just
Mhm.
because I can ride this horse doesn't necessarily mean that I always should be. I didn't feel like anyways because and you could ride him, you know, you'd be riding him in a bit versus riding him bitless was really different.
Yeah.
Having a horse that moves into pressure when you're riding him versus
Mhm.
away, like again, very different experience. Those are things that need to be worked on, but are
Yeah.
often best learned from the ground in a safe way.
Yes, it's so true.
And
And that's a tricky thing for so many of us to really embody. And, there's so much pressure, like external and often internal, to do more of the writing piece and not necessarily spend as much time focusing on the foundational elements. But, when you've got a horse who's had some trauma in their background and you have a horse that's not necessarily trusting yet, yeah, of the partnership or of themselves or their own knowledge, like they lack confidence. I find often we're so quick to just like start hammering them with things, but in doing so, we don't build the confidence. We often shut it down. And, I feel like you've taken a lot of time and that's taken a fair bit of courage on your part to say, hey, like this isn't working for me and it's not working for him. And so I'm going to approach it differently so that I can build him up and encourage relationship and encourage communication as opposed to stifling him and stifling his response to things because it seems unfavorable. Like a horse that you can't
yeah,
brush because they're so sensitive and they're distrusting and they're dysregulated. Well, that's a highly undesirable trait or behavior for a horse to exhibit. And so too frequently, like, we're very quick to, like, try and squash that and nip it in the bud, and same
Yeah.
with, mouthiness, but yeah, horses explore the world through their muzzle, and so we're often so quick to just be like, "Well, don't do that." But why?
Yeah.
Like, why do we view these things as unfavorable? And why do we view certain other things as favorable when so often they're actually signs of shutdown? They're so
Yeah.
often signs of a horse that's really quite vacant and like checked out. And it's just interesting the dynamic. And I feel like we had some great conversations about that just around like allowing a horse to communicate something with us and
Yeah.
then taking in what that means, and then, like, where do we go from here with that, right? And I feel like that's somewhere that you've done a
Yeah.
great job, and it hasn't necessarily been easy because, I'd be interested to know more, like, did you feel like you had people that were really aligned with the direction that you were trying to go? Or did it feel like it had to be a bit more of a solo journey and going against the grain a little bit too?
Yeah. I think that's an interesting question because I think where I'm sitting now, I don't know that maybe it had to be as much of a solo journey as maybe
Mm.
I made it. Maybe
Mm.
if I would have started asking some more questions, or maybe cultivating some other different like relationships that were different sooner, then maybe it might not have been as solo of a journey. Because, obviously meeting folks like yourself and like, more recently, I've been to a couple different clinics with him and talked to some different new and different trainers,
Yeah.
and they've been so reassuring. And were able to also show me the value of listening to the horse in the moment instead of pushing through tension. And I would just say so much of the other, I think like well-meaning, advice, especially with a young green horse with a history of trauma, is that you should just push through, right? It's because 'cause they're green. It's because they don't know. And that is true in some ways. And
Yeah.
riding a horse who is filled with tension that feels like they're gonna explode in any direction at a time,
Yeah.
I think feels horrible, especially when you really care about that horse and you know that riding them isn't always like that,
Mhm.
and in fact, it often isn't. So if that's
Yeah.
how it's feeling, maybe, maybe we can work through it, but maybe, maybe that isn't the day for it. Maybe there's something
Yeah.
else that could be more beneficial on the relationship and the training pathway that you can make a pivot to
Yeah.
that is going to better serve them and you. So I think it's being maybe more a bit more open. But yeah, absolutely. I think that being someone who does a lot of groundwork or liberty work, and I learned that with my last horse who also had some health issues. Yeah, I think there's a lot of questions about that. Why
Mhm.
spending so much time on that?
Yeah.
How it has value. They're not going to get better in their body or stronger without being ridden, is what I
Mhm.
often hear.
Such
If
a
he's
common misconception, isn't it?
and I haven't I mean, I haven't found that to be true in my
Right.
um
Yeah, well,
um
and it's not true, like, empirically, it's untrue. Horses don't need to be ridden to be strong and to be healthy and to gain balance, and in fact, there's a lot of ways that we could and arguably should be building that strength and fitness and balance without a rider, such that they're more equipped to handle when we do put a rider on. Because, of course, we're imbalanced and we're imperfect. And
yeah.
we have, a stronger side and a weaker side, or asymmetries in our own bodies and timing issues and things like that that can really impact the horse. And
Yeah.
yet, so often we kind of forget about that. We almost look at ourselves. I mean, people have a very high view of themselves a lot of the time, and often think, okay, well, we're the be all end all. So, of course, we're going to be benefiting this horse by riding them. But will we? Like, if you sit a little heavier in your right seat bone and you're really locked in your right elbow, you're going to be creating issues in that horse and asymmetries in that
Yeah.
horse
How could we not?
without knowing it. Exactly. And how can we not? And it's not that we need to be perfect. It's why we need to be aware. We need to be aware of the fact that there's actually a lot of ways that we can and probably should be building horses up properly to
Yeah.
support the rider and building them up mentally and emotionally as well. Because
Yeah.
the matter is, and you and I have talked a little bit about this, but we strip away most of horses' core needs and then we expect them to like go and do the job and we expect them to do it perfectly. Like, we make them
Yes.
straight. And if they're going straight, they need to be straight and they need to be tracking up and they need to be forward, but they also need to be soft and they need to be over their back. And then they need to bend and they need to bend well and, not
Yeah.
bulge the shoulder, not drop the shoulder, not pop
Not
the cage,
overflex.
not overflex, like not curl,
Yeah.
not get behind the leg, and all of that is a lot to expect of an animal that doesn't really have a foundation yet.
I think it is a lot to expect. And I think I've been told recently, by some new and different trainers in my life that I'm expecting too much of
Mm.
my horse. My expectations are too high of him. And my tolerance for him making mistakes or not doing the things that he should know, does know, can do seems low. And, I so appreciate that they shared that with me
Yes.
because, I think they were really right.
Mm.
But what is also fascinating is that previous advice I, have received, even, within, the you receive a lot of advice. A lot of it we pay for and I, take very seriously. And also some of it I don't pay for and it's offered sometimes with the best of intentions. And, I think the horse industry is really great at providing unsolicited advice,
Yes.
to other
And
people.
not always with the best of intentions, like, I
Well,
will just call that out. It's very generous of you to say that, and
yeah,
every barn atmosphere and environment is different, but, what I see is a lot of people offering unsolicited advice, not necessarily with the best of intentions for the horse, for the
yeah,
rider, or for the dynamic, and I think it's important for people to think about that. And, again, a big reason why I felt like I was so inspired by what you're doing is, in spite of maybe all of the opinions that you're being given, like you're really tuning in to Regalo and what he needs from you and what he needs in his world to start thriving. But that's not always easy for us to do because those inputs, and those opinions can be really strong. They can be really loud, and sometimes they can be really detrimental because they're
for
not
sure.
necessarily geared at what's in the horse's best interest or the best interest of their training. So, you know, just wanted to
Yeah.
interject
Well,
with
I
that.
mean,
Not to say that everybody's got ill
I
intent, because certainly
appreciate
that's not the
that.
case. But
No, and you're right. I think that's my diplomatic way of saying that, that's what I choose to focus on, or
yes,
like that's what they can bring that day. But
yeah,
like, yeah, is it always kind? Is it always useful? Is it always open or even is it often? Frequently
yeah,
not.
yeah.
you know?
Right, all the questions.
Real. Yeah,
Yes. Like,
and it's so fascinating because I do think sometimes I know some of the most incredible people in the, equestrian industry and they are incredibly gracious people and are knowledgeable and I'm so lucky to have them in my life. And also, there's been instances where truly some of the coaching or some of the advice is very tough love and is
mm.
incredibly critical, right? And like I grew up being coached with having someone scream at me,
Oh, yeah.
and right and tell you how awful you were and how all the things you're doing wrong and critique your body and critique your position and it was so normalized that was
Yeah.
just but it's also the 90s and there's a lot of other things that were quite normalized, but like that really I think also impacts how people, get into and stay in equestrian sports. I was so it was such an aha moment when I
Mm.
had this other trainer say, "You're being too hard on him in this
Mhm.
way, XYZ," and then proceed to show me what it could look like differently. And then, follow it back around with like, you need to listen to him more because look what is possible when you're
Mm.
not doing so much forcing and cajoling and pushing and holding and all these
Mhm.
things. And I think what a flip side, what so interesting for me in that moment and so humbling was that I was also receiving advice that I was being, I wasn't pushing him hard enough.
Yeah,
I
you're being
should
way too easy on him.
I was being way too easy on him,
Yeah.
I need to be more disciplined and he needs to be more disciplined and we both need to be more focused and I need to not let him pull me around so much in the saddle and not be so giving with my hands and I need to hold my body differently like or more firmly and I being too flexible and accommodating to him and this is why we're not further along.
Mhm.
And watching and seeing what and so also I'm not a professional. So if if a professional that I trust is telling me this, my first inclination is to say okay and do it
Yeah,
and try it. And
absolutely.
and it's not that I think I know better. It's actually very much the opposite. I'm very
Mhm.
open
Yeah.
to the guidance and the recommendation and a professional opinion. And if you're doing that for an extended amount of time and you start to notice that things are not getting better necessarily,
Mhm.
then maybe it's not the right fit for you and or maybe it isn't the right fit for the horse in combination. What I would say is that seeing my horse then ridden with a different approach, the one that
Mhm.
I at least had understood that I should be avoiding, and seeing such a small change, such a big change in a small amount of
Mhm.
time
Yeah.
was I think it just really kind of brought me out of, my really like narrow-minded perspective I had at the time,
Mhm.
and also the frustration that I had because I was starting to get frustrated for
Yeah.
sure, I think is the reality. And
Yeah.
and this felt really hopeful. But it also I went like, "Oh," I was kind of at the point where I was like, "Oh," like really losing my confidence because I was
Mhm.
doing this thing that should work and it's not working.
Yeah,
And
and I
I'm like,
hear that so often. Like,
"Ah, it's me. It's never my
yes.
horse really. It's always me and I'm okay to take some ownership." But I was like, "Well, maybe huh." And, I really need to learn and do some things differently. But then also having another professional, provide an alternate perspective and then show the results that could happen with that, put me it did reinforce that I wasn't doing things right, of course, and I
Mhm.
don't know everything and I don't think I do, but also I knew something. I knew that
Yes.
what I was told not to do that seemed to
Mhm.
work when I did it. Why I didn't understand why I should be doing it differently. Oh, because this is, the way it should be and this is the
Yeah.
steps we need to follow and it's very linear. Gave me some confidence back also at the same time, like a ton of humility. I heard what I needed to hear. And I was doing things wrong and it was to his detriment. And that's 100% on me to do, like to own, because even if I'm being coached on it, I'm still the one who's doing it.
Yeah.
Right. And I did also know those other pieces. I just stuffed those away.
And, like, that is
So
huge,
that was like, my
and
brain was like,
right? And
yeah,
that is one of the big things that, like, I was like, "Oh, we need to talk about that," because it's something that I see so frequently, right? We approach the sport and we approach our coaches like, "Okay, the knowledge that they have, like, we really value, and that's fabulous." The
absolutely.
challenge becomes when the approach that they are recommending, as to say preaching, but the approach
Yeah,
that they feel is best, if we see it not working for our horse and I'm always like, I wanna highlight this for any of our listeners because I feel like I meet so many people who say this to me, or we might have a conversation where I'm like, this seems a little off." And then a year later, they've moved barns, they've switched trainers, and they're like, "Yo, you were right. Like that, my horse was so unhappy. They were so dysregulated. And the approach was
Yeah.
so misaligned with who that horse is that it was just like perpetuating the cycle of
Yeah.
whatever the issue is that we're trying to solve." And the challenge is I see that so frequently. And what I also see is we end up questioning ourselves because we're like,
Mm.
"Oh, well, like the trainer knows best, and it's obviously just our fault because we're not doing it well enough. And, I obviously just need to try harder. Obviously, my horse just sucks. Obviously, I just suck." And so often it's
Yeah.
actually that trainer doesn't have the tools to help you. And
Yeah.
they don't have the knowledge or the understanding of your particular horse and an approach that will actually work for them. And so often, like you had mentioned being frustrated. And, I feel like I
Yeah.
say this often, but frustration starts where knowledge ends. And so the challenge becomes if we're relying on trainers who don't have the knowledge that they need to help us solve the problem, they're frustrated, but they're not going to admit it because the challenges of the industry make it that everybody's really trying to maintain their client base. And none of us know everything. So if we haven't experienced a highly sensitive, highly reactive horse, a PRE that's also highly athletic, really quick moving, really quick thinking, it has a bunch of trauma, like that's a pretty unique set of characteristics. Well, and or if we're maybe a little old school in the approach, we just might not have the necessary knowledge or skill set to help that horse and that
Yeah.
rider in that situation. And it's not to take away from any
Totally.
coach's experience or expertise. It's just to empower riders to say, hey, like, your horse the
Yeah.
best. And, if you're finding that you're fighting this losing battle with a trainer and that you're walking away from sessions feeling frustrated, feeling really disheartened, questioning yourself, questioning your horse, questioning your relationship with them. I like that you mentioned, you started meeting other trainers and you were like, "Oh, wow." And I've had that experience certainly. And one of the reasons that I really was passionate about doing the podcast is to share these different perspectives with people. Because the challenge is so often we wind up in our little bubbles, our barn bubbles. And
Yeah.
so we're exposed to a certain way of doing things or a certain mentality. But, like, that might just be the way things are being done in this barn or in the classical dressage world or in the hunter world or the jumper world or the eck world, what have you. But then there's all of these other options that
Yeah.
aren't even in our orbit, because we're over here. And
Yeah.
so opening up the conversation to the fact that, it might only take a couple sessions with a different trainer who has a different approach for us to really gain a lot of knowledge and valuable insight to how our particular
Yeah.
horse thinks and why maybe those standard training methodologies aren't working so well for them. And that's so often the foundation of our frustration as opposed to the
Yeah.
individual things that the horse is doing. It's a misunderstanding of the communication that's happening there and how
Yeah.
to start showing up for them in a better way.
Yeah. And miscommunications are the foundation of so many like conflicts that
Yeah.
really with our horses, like with others. And I really it's like it's the totality of the situation, right?
Yeah.
It's the horse and it's that moment in that horse's training and it's the environment and that's the person and what,
Mhm.
they're bringing to the table and it's the coach and what they're bringing to the table in that moment. And it's that I think it's that recipe of all those things together. And maybe that recipe of all those things together is never really going to be the right fit. Or maybe the timing is off or maybe the mindset is off or maybe the environment is off. So, I've been thinking a lot more about that too because, one of, when I'm kind of like, oh, I some of the advice I was getting, I didn't feel like was working for him and me, some of the coaching I was getting, and so I started to look into other options because I had to just be like, this is not working. It was working for a bit and then it wasn't. Like even we had a saddle
Yes.
that worked for a while and then it wasn't working and then we got it fixed and then it was working better, but then it wasn't working again. So then we got fixed again and then somehow it was way worse.
Mm.
And now we need a whole new plan, even though this was supposed to be the infinitely adjustable saddle that was going to be the saddle for life.
Yeah.
but getting an agreement of, yeah, actually, this isn't the right one for him. Maybe another 2 years, once he's mature and his body has changed and all these things. But even some of the coaching I've received, there's some good pieces, but there's other pieces that weren't, that threw the whole other thing off. And that
Yeah.
coaching, helped me absolutely transform my last horse.
Mm.
Like, it truly was. But I kind of felt from the beginning that that style of coaching and that approach was not the right time or the right fit for the horse I have right now,
Mhm.
because he's almost the opposite type of horse than my old
Yeah.
horse, which I also
Yeah.
sought out because I was still grieving my last horse, and I knew, like, I didn't want to compare to her. So I wanted something really different.
Mhm.
So I sometimes you get what you asked for, and then you're like, why did I ask for this?
Yeah.
But okay.
I guess I should have been more careful what I
Yeah,
wished for.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And oh, you mean all the other things I learned that worked really well for her, like, don't work that great for him?
Now they're out the
Oh,
window.
well,
Perfect.
yeah,
Just starting
and
from scratch.
a little bit of that, right? Which is what I signed up for. But well,
Mhm.
that's the thing. It's a really different also person. I think a horse that maybe isn't as sensitive, with more maturity and more foundation and more training, who maybe internalizes things a little bit more instead of my guy, which is like the polar opposite of that right now. That
Mhm.
might have worked better for him. Or, my past horse ended up really, she was quite a perfectionist, and she liked to do things again and again, actually, until they were like kind of perfect. Like, she was incredibly disciplined
Mhm.
that was why we spent so much time on classical dressage, because she really loved it. And she'd offer the moves and at Liberty all the time, and she just, you could tell she just wanted to nail it.
Yeah.
And that's incredible. Whereas the horse I have right now, he does it once, he nails it. Amazing. He loves hearing he's a good boy. He does it a second time. He's kind of annoyed that you've asked him to
Mhm.
do it a second time because he already did it once right. But now by the time you're on the third shot of doing the same ish thing again that he thinks he's already accomplished, he's getting frustrated because he's not
Yes.
sure why he's being asked to do the same thing over and over again. So, like, drilling with a horse like that,
Yeah.
and in is not his favorite. Maybe with more training or more maturity or more relationship or less tension, maybe, maybe we'll learn some more focus together. But also
Mm.
expecting a very young in mind and body. And I would just say also, like, the opposite of like like an old soul. Like, my old horse was an old soul.
Yeah.
My new horse is like a new soul.
And those.
So, really, like, right? Like, there, to me, Regalo is not like, yeah, an old soul personality,
No.
right? Like, he's a sweetheart, but he's new. And
Yes, I would agree. Yeah, and, like, you know, he is totally, like, looking at the world through fresh baby eyes, and, like, the
yeah.
experiences that he's having, it's like he's totally having them for the first time, and yet I think very in line with the PRE is, like, most of the PRE horses I meet, they don't wanna be doing the same thing over and over again. They're
No,
like,
they're
"I've got
bored.
it. Like, what are we doing here? Like, come on." Because 'cause they're more forward thinking than that, and they're like,
Yeah.
"Okay, we got it, move along. Like, what's next? What's next?" Um, and so it is amazing because we totally have to tailor the way that we're approaching things with them. And I know you had mentioned previously, and one of the conversations that I loved that we sort of dug into was, you had mentioned like horses really demand growth from us
Yeah.
and they make us kind of rise to the occasion. Like, what are the ways that you would
Yeah.
say because your horses were so different, like, what are
Mhm.
the ways that each of them required you to grow in as a horse person?
And what a good question. I mean, both of them have taught are teaching me, more and more about, um, self-awareness and emotional regulation and alignment, like
Mhm.
internal alignment, that congruence of self. And I would say that my last horse, Gabrielle, she's the one who really made it obvious to me that the congruence was required
I love that.
for her.
Yeah.
And I would say she was a horse with a ton of integrity.
Mm.
Um, and she was also slow to trust. Like, she also, you couldn't lose your cool with her. And I'd heard other people, she's dangerous and she's unpredictable and she's
Mhm.
explosive and she was all these things, which she wasn't actually. But she'd learned how to
Yeah.
push through or push around people and get her way.
Interesting.
And um, but she'd also was without relationship for a long time. So she, I think, struggled with that. So for me, what I learned really quickly is that internal congruence really, really important. So how I showed up that day mattered every single time,
Yes.
and I learned so much about self-settling
Mm.
myself, so I could
Yeah.
show up in partnership with her. So
Yeah.
I would say she was an incredible teacher on that. She
Mhm.
also had 0 like, if you kind of lost your cool, I'd see, people, even if they're sometimes trying to handle her and they get angry at her and she would just, like, escalate, you could almost just see it in her eye.
Yeah.
She was sorta like, "Oh." She was the type of horse was like, "Oh, like, you wanna go?" Like, she wasn't like the people are like, "Oh, just tell them you mean business." Like, there's that sort of attitude, like,
For sure there
tell
is.
them to
Yeah.
smarten up, like, I grew up like, "Give that horse a smack and tell them that you mean it, and show them who's
Yeah.
boss and get after
Totally.
it." Yeah, and that Gabrielle, that was never gonna work with. She was
Yeah.
like, "No, you're not actually."
You're cute.
Well, sort of, and I think she had so much maturity, like, you could almost hear her roll her eyes, like, she was just like, "Absolutely not," right?
Yeah.
So that wasn't ever gonna work. So you weren't gonna get into a
Mhm.
fight with her. So it was
Yeah.
very much like ask, they say, like, "Ask a mare, tell a gelding." Well, I don't even know if that's fully true. Like, I don't know a lot of horses that work best with being told all the time, maybe just not the
Yeah.
ones in my personal life, I know those exist, but, um, yeah, so she was like, you needed to learn to negotiate
Yeah.
with her, and
Yeah,
I
well, and that's partnership, and it's funny because I feel like I've had that conversation with people quite a bit recently, like and the congruence piece that you brought up, that's a huge element, like, at the end of the day, if we're showing up with incongruence, whether we recognize it or not, our nervous systems can sense that, especially if we're attuned to
yes,
them, and
yeah,
so, if one day I show up and I'm one way, and then another time I'm showing up another way, that's fine provided it's, like, congruent with how I'm communicating and, I might be a little tired, and that's okay, I can own that, or I might be a little stressed, or I might be running late, or I might be this, or I
yeah,
might be that, and I feel like you and I talked about this, like, horses have a pretty big tolerance for that, like, they can
yeah,
really handle a lot from us in the grand scheme, provided we're upfront about it and we're kinda honest, and that's
yeah,
where
we
the
own it.
congruence piece comes in, and so those horses that it is a bit of a negotiation. Well, hey, fair. Like we one of the things that I'm always telling people is like we don't show up the same every day. We don't wake up on the same side of the bed every day. Some days you roll out of bed and you're stiff and you're sore and you're tired and you didn't sleep super well and your brain's foggy and you know, and other days you wake up and you're full of piss and vinegar, you're ready to roll, and the brain's firing on all cylinders. And horses are the same, but we have so little tolerance for their variations. And it's so often this, and we talked about this and in the Warwick Scheller
Yeah,
podcast that we were talking about earlier,
yeah,
we talk about this, like the power over
yes,
mentality and like in the domestication of animals, we also are like passing on our domestication and how we've been like shamed into alignment with a certain protocol. So don't be too loud. You and I both talked about being neurodivergent and I'm
yeah,
a little on the spicy side. So,
yeah, the
with
neurospicy.
ADHD, like
Yeah,
we're often too loud or too opinionated or too distracted or just too much muchness.
yeah,
And just like society often has such a small window of tolerance for that in people, especially in
yeah,
women, uh,
absolutely.
we also tend to have a really small window of tolerance for behavior in animals and like not be willing to accept how they're showing up or that like we're trying to be in relationship with them, and being in relationship, i.e. being in partnership with a
Yeah.
horse, is not us dictating how they must be all the time with zero tolerance or wiggle room around how they're feeling, what they're communicating, and how we're showing up and asking, right? And so
Yeah.
it's neat because I hear you kinda saying in that, it had to become a negotiation with her. It's like, yeah, really, like, any partnership is that to a degree. Because if we think for a
Absolutely.
second that, like, we have or should have a right over a horse, that's just not true, It's an honor that they allow us to be in partnership with them, but so often
Yeah.
we look at it as this, like, dominating, domineering, controlling force,
Yeah.
and it's a dictatorship as opposed to it's a partnership, but that dictatorship, you run into some real hard limits with it, and when horses put their foot down with us, it's like they
Mhm.
do it in no small way quite often, and, a lot of the time, they'll take a lot from us,
Yeah.
but I think it's really also high time we start looking more about what we're bringing to the dynamic, and, like, if we expect them to be so perfect all the time and we expect them to do everything we're asking, how are we showing up to that partnership? And what are we giving to them to meet their needs? And what are we giving to them to, like, make ourselves worthy of their partnership and their cooperation and their showing up for us? Like, why do we seem to think it's so one-sided? And it's just such an interesting dynamic that we.
Right? I mean, you said that beautifully, and you really did, and yeah, what value are we bringing to this
Yeah.
relationship? And I would say that, if Gabrielle could have spoken, she would have asked me that. And so it was
Mm.
so evidently on blast that this dominant type of, relational dynamic that I had in my brain that I needed to like tame this dragon this way by being like a kind of like a bigger, more firm leader for her. And what does firmness mean, right? I had to re-examine that as well. And so what I think is fascinating how that carried forward with with Regalo is that, well, he's younger, and I would say just that newness to him, he really benefits from leadership.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm not talking about like this again going back to this authoritarian dictator sort
Mm.
of situation.
Yeah.
Like he does better with invitations still, I find, but with me putting the invitation out there because we had to negotiate that early on. I think it
Mm.
was obvious that he wasn't maybe used to being listened to or in new situations, like he'll be on really good behavior and was really quiet. And then kind of like, but he was hyper vigilant. Like, he
Mm.
was worried for the other shoe to drop, you know? He was, like, waiting to see what was gonna happen, and I think once he realized that maybe something wasn't gonna happen, and that maybe this is also a bit of a combination of some of the study behaviors that he came with, which was another
Mm.
reason why he had been hard to find a new home for, is that he came with a bunch of more traditionally study behaviors, and we don't, I think, always really like those, right?
Yeah, and what
Uh,
were some of those behaviors?
yeah, he would, like he pushed through, go to pressure, really vocal.
Mm.
He would like and he still does, like he will get excited about different things pretty quickly that are not, maybe appropriately exciting or things that we think should be arousing and he's
Yeah.
ready to rock, but then he's
Mm.
ready to go to that type of work. And
Yeah,
he is prancing and calling and his brain is in a different mindset.
yeah.
And he's really settled out of those, I would say. But one of the things about him, um, I think there's this idea that he needs this like really strong leadership. It was almost like what I
Mm.
was told at the start. Like he needs, like, give him an inch, he's gonna take a mile kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
And and I did go through a phase with him where he did start testing me quite hard. right? And he did. He started biting and he started pushing and, and to try and negotiate our relationship also and our dynamics of
Mm.
who's making what call.
Yeah.
And once he learned he could say no, and I've had some really great teachers also around what would it mean to work with our horses in a consent-based way,
Mm.
and starting to explore that, like, that blew my mind. I was like, "What? Okay, like, how do we what about giving some choice, but what actually if we start asking consent?"
Yeah.
And, navigating that, it was interesting because I also had some support with, well, if you're gonna give him a lot of choice, and then he's saying no, and learning he can say no, like, you need to be like, you can't be upset that he's saying no.
Right. And that like, was that challenging? Because I
Yeah,
feel yeah. Even for
yeah,
me, sometimes I'm like, "Shit," it's almost like, of course, we get even if unintentionally, like, sometimes we get some ego behind it, and we're like,
yeah,
"Oh, they don't
totally.
with me, sad," or, "Oh, huh, what now?" Like, I thought we were going somewhere. I thought we were a team, and then but it's so interesting because once you start working on the basis of consent with your horses, you know that the yes is legit. It's authentic and they're like
It
showing up
means
because
more.
they want to be there. And that changes the dynamic so much, and I
Yeah,
found like makes it so much more satisfying because
yeah,
they're showing up typically with much more softness and
yes.
a lot more ease in their mind and their body that then allows for a much more diverse range of communication and skills to be developed.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yes, absolutely, and
Mm.
I was thinking, I'm like, where did that kind of shift also start happening? And I don't think I wouldn't have had maybe the confidence to take on, like, a newly gelded, horse because of all the stereotype that comes with it if I hadn't also spent some time maybe, like, with all the stallions that I had just spent, like, it was,
Yeah.
within a month. So, there's also that, and what I learned from work
Mm.
this woman, this trainer who had all these she had over 20, stallions that she cared for, and she did it with so much gentleness,
Mm.
and you could tell how much they respected and loved her,
Mm.
and she had to do very, very little because of the relationship that she had, and
Mm.
she meant business, and you certainly you knew that you knew she was gonna stand on business, but was she was fair,
Mm.
firm, but she was soft with
Mm.
them, like, she was just gentle with them. And she said that for her, that was also so important. You needed to
Yeah.
be really, really gentle. And it didn't mean that you weren't the boss, and it didn't mean, that you weren't gonna provide direction in times of, like, when they need to take direction and you need to keep
Mhm.
everyone safe, like, they're gonna look to you for your consistent but firm and fair, but
Mm.
also, like, a gentleness to the equation, and I think that people are like, "No, like, horses are rough with each other, and we should be rough with them to be taken
Mhm.
seriously, and haven't you seen stallions fight?" And, like, "What you need to show that horse that" and I did see them fight there, like, and it
Yeah.
was, like, full on, it was quite intimidating, but I didn't see her intimidate her horses once. I didn't see
Mm.
her act in any sort of harsh way, you know, at all, and I asked her about it
That's
because I was curious. It was some of the most gentle horse handling I'd ever seen, and I just hadn't
awesome.
expected someone who's got, plus 20 stallions or hanging out that this would be, like, the most harmonious environment. So,
Yes, and, I love hearing about this because I think so often, we misassign things, so we
yeah.
assign moodiness to mares and we assign,
Yes.
danger to studs and we assign dopiness to geldings and, you know,
Totally.
we in doing that, like, we strip them of so much of their individuality, and in doing so, like, we miss so much of the nuance, and, I guess, like, lacking in nuance almost ties into our earlier conversation about how frequently, like, we're shamed into behaving a certain way. So be less of who you authentically are and be more like this little thing that's actually acceptable. Don't be too outspoken,
Yeah.
don't be too loud, don't talk too much, don't be too smart, don't be too stupid, don't be too pretty, don't
Yep.
be too ugly, don't be too skinny, don't be too fat. Just
Yep.
stay within this like very thin window of tolerance. And similarly, like we have
Yeah.
just like so little nuance in our understanding of horses and their personalities and all the dynamics there, but also in terms of like herd behavior and training methodologies and modalities. Because, like you
Mm.
said, we think that it needs to be so firm because, yeah, okay, when studs are fighting, it's big and loud and boisterous, but most of the communication that happens between horses is not that. It's
No,
it's a look,
not at all.
it's a furrowing of the brow,
It's subtle.
it's a little twitch of the muzzle, like, "Get away from me,"
Yeah.
it's so subtle. And
Subtle.
we tend to communicate in ways that are so loud. And,
Yep.
you mentioned earlier in terms of, like, training being linear, humans are linear thinkers. Horses are not. And
No.
so we're trying to like barge full steam ahead with our mission, our entitlement, our idea of what should be happening. And we're doing it big and loud and aggressively with very little respect for them and how they think and how they're communicating with us. And we just miss so much of the picture. We miss so much of how they're showing up to the dynamic and how we have the potential to positively influence them in how we show up in the dynamic.
Yes.
And I think that's huge. Like, I often have people, if I want a horse to move a limb, like I just look at it and maybe point, or I like indicate that maybe towards their chest. I want them to back. And people are like, oh my God, they just listened to that. And it's like, yeah, we're communicating, and we're communicating softly and we're communicating gently. And I'm meeting them where they're at. I'm not coming in and telling them to move their foot, and so often it's like, back, 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 back. It's like, whoa now. Like, whoa, simmer down. We need like this much of that ask, not this much of an ask, but so
Yes.
many of the ways that we're being taught are to ask really big. And the challenge with that is we almost never give horses the opportunity to attune to something that's small from us because we're always
Mm.
showing up in such loud ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what are we also modeling then for
Yeah.
our horses? Like if we aren't catching also the more nuanced behavior
Mm.
or communication and we're doing it all, big and human.
Yeah.
And what have they learned then about having to communicate with us?
Mhm.
Right? Like I think that's something both of my horses have taught me and have learned a lot off their backs and I still need to learn a lot more is that what about those most subtle cues? Because if you miss those communications, then that's often also when the behaviors start to amp up. You get more, right? And then we're like, well, that's not what we want. But like, what did we miss that made the horse feel like they needed to go to this level of communication? Like, and there's also patterns of behavior and, they get in
Mm.
them, we get in them, all those things. Like, what could we have, listened sooner
Mhm.
to a different piece of like to a different communication tool
Yeah.
from them,
Yeah.
you know? And
Absolutely.
I think that we can. I think that we can. I think actually horses are really patient teachers.
Yes. And
Uh,
very understanding, and I think
very gracious with us,
yeah,
actually. And they're
they
probably like,
really
what
are.
a bunch of boneheads these humans are that are missing all these things, right? Like, I truly think our lack of sensory awareness sometimes compared to a horse, like, they must just think, like, what is wrong with y'all that
Mm,
you missed this?
it's so true.
You
Yeah.
know, because like sometimes
Mhm.
I feel very inadequate compared to like what I know, like what horses are able to sense and hear, and I think that's where the idea of partnership comes in because they know and can do and can feel things that we cannot. And we also have some of those unique things. So if we bring those together and we can learn to communicate and share those with each other, we're going to be a lot stronger. And that's where I actually think learning to develop and partner with our horses actually helps us learn and develop as humans and
Mhm.
learn a lot of transferable skills that aren't just valuable with our horses. I think they're valuable for life. And
Mhm.
and horses provide a really unique opportunity for that call in, for that growth, but are also amazing teachers for
Yeah.
us. Um and I do truly believe that for sure.
Yeah. I agree as well. And I'm really glad that you're sort of sharing that perspective because that's been a huge part of my growth journey with horses. And we're never finished. We're never done learning. There's always so much more
Yeah.
that we can tune into. And anytime I look back on where I've come from in my journey with horses or my level of communication with them, it's like, "Oh my god, I knew nothing." And I feel like I said to you one day,
And probably
it
so much at the
is
same time.
yeah, like, the more you know, the more you're like, "I know
I
nothing."
know nothing.
Just, like, barely
Oh,
scratched the surface of all these things, whether it's saddle fitting, animal behavior, biomechanics, equine nutrition, osteopathy, all these pieces, like, there's just so much to know, but one of the things that I can say really definitively that's helped so profoundly in my experience with horses is learning to listen and learning to
mm,
tune into ourselves, our own state, and how we're showing up for them makes such a difference. Like,
yeah,
as soon as we can quiet the noise, whether it's internal or external, so whether it's the voices coming from the people in your barn who maybe aren't approving or think you need to do X, Y, and Z with your horse, stop and think like, how is my horse responding? How are they experiencing this? How do they show up when I'm at their stall door? How do they respond when I pull out the halter? How do they act at the mounting block? And let's get attuned to the communication that's happening that's maybe a little bit more subtle. And let's start like quieting down our communication. And it's so funny
mm,
because even when we're aware and we're quiet, like it was interesting because I'm going to tie in, hopefully it's okay with you, tie
yeah.
into a moment that we had during your saddle fitting where Regalo was like coming to you quite a bit to kind of check in and
I
like,
was just thinking about this as an example. So yes, please tell this because I was going to,
yes.
but you're going to tell it better. So tell it.
Well,
But
I was
yes,
going to say you
exactly.
probably tell it better,
No, no, no,
but
no. No, you do. Please.
okay.
This is
Share my perspective because
yeah, yeah.
this is the interesting thing when we're working with somebody who maybe is viewing it through a slightly different lens and how it can just expand our awareness. So, essentially the situation was that he'd been out in the cross ties, we'd done some tracings, we had looked at his back, we'd done some energy stuff because he had some tension that we were trying to work out. He had the initial stranger danger, which he got over very quickly, but then the barn was getting really busy. There was a lot of stuff happening. And he was like checking in with Caitlin a lot and getting very orally fixated.
Yeah.
And what I could see was that that was actually amping him up as opposed to, like, helping him regulate, and this is
Yeah.
the thing, that a little, like, mouth play and nose play can be fabulous for helping them just calm down. It can be great to, like,
Totally.
head lowered, which is what we did in the beginning. When I came in, it was like, "Let's get the head low, let's get rid of the stranger
Yeah.
danger, let's let him know,
Yeah.
like, this is
Focus on
about him."
relaxation.
Yeah. Whereas as we got a little later in the session when he was doing it with you, it was like he was escalating and he was getting
Yeah.
antsier and a little more anxious. And, you could just kind of see the nervous system struggling to regulate a little bit more. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I had you kind of step away a little bit and helped him just like, hey, you're okay. And it was funny because I started to do a little bit of energy work with him and
Yeah.
show him, and he was just like, like, I need to do something. I need to do something. And then he was kind of like,
Oh.
okay, I guess I don't need to do anything. And it was
Oh,
just,
yeah, yeah, big sigh. He did a big tension release. Oh, yeah.
and then he just stood. He didn't care about the fact that there was suddenly like 10 people in the barn. In fact, he was calmer than he was when there were no people in the barn. And it
Yeah.
was just like his whole demeanor had dropped a few octaves, it was just like the noise in his body, the noise in his nervous system had really settled.
Yeah.
And it's funny how sometimes we want to support them through a moment of anxiety or escalation in their nervous system. And
Mhm.
in trying to do so, we're actually just kind of continuing this like escalation or coping, like what looks like a coping behavior that's
Yes.
actually allowing them to kind of continue to become more dysregulated.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a prime example of, like, when him and I, like, just feed into each other because
Yeah.
we also have I think that we have quite a good close relationship.
Yeah, we
But yeah,
definitely.
like if I'm not if he's getting amped and I'm not actively working to there's kind of like there's like playful side that sometimes diffuses things with him that works quite well. I think play is
Yeah.
the other thing he taught me. But if I'm not successful in like myself coming down because sometimes I amp with him and sometimes he amps with me and then we just kind of co-spin as
Yeah.
well. So it's like I
I
don't,
love that.
I want to just I don't have this all figured out, some days or some moments I'm way better than others. So it's also
Yeah.
about knowing what I have access to in that moment and where I think a lot of self-awareness is important, but as imperfect beings, some days I got it also, and some days I don't really got it. But that was a situation too where I was like, oh, we're doing this again. And like, I wasn't, I think, I wasn't settling with him. I was getting more amped. So, you know, you being able to also, like, identify that,
Mm.
I would say identify it in a way that, um, like, is also, I think, a bit of an art and a skill for, like, identifying that, but then also, he wasn't really left on his own. I moved
Mhm.
away, and you helped him. You were in a much more regulated space than I was in that moment, obviously, and you were still with him, and he fussed for a while and had a little upset, and then he came down and he was good. And so for me, like, I was like, "Ooh, this woman's really skilled." I was like, "I love it." And because I
Thank
I
you.
I think, we could say, yeah, I was part of the problem in that moment and, and often am probably all throughout it, and me moving away was helpful, but I actually think that because I have moved away in the past and sometimes without the support or without another regulated
Mhm.
human, or if the
Yes.
practitioner I'm with is, like, even more elevated than I am, or, like, which has actually also happened quite a bit because he sometimes people see the reactivity in horses and they've had whatever experiences they've had and, like, they're also nervous, and this isn't a horse they
Yeah,
trust.
totally.
And,
Yeah.
like, often, like, it can get dangerous too, and, like, safety is most important thing, so I also understand that. So, yeah, just your ability to be with him without trying to actively physically settle him the way I was, worked so effectively.
Yeah.
Um, and that's where how we show up, what our energy is like,
Mhm. Yeah,
is
and
so
this
important.
absolutely, and knowing that there's so many different ways that we can use our energy to
Yeah.
influence them. And that was a really good example of co-regulation. And it's
Yeah.
funny because you weren't doing anything wrong at all. It was just like,
Yeah.
we were talking, so there was probably a fair bit of energy there, and he was just, like, feeling all of the energy because the horse had, like, just come in behind, and there was a bunch of stuff happening with that horse and the rider, and, like, then there's a bunch of stuff happening at the front of the barn, and he'd been standing for a long time and, and. So there was a lot of reasons for, like, him to be escalating
Yeah.
and, you know
And totally. There totally was, and where was I in that moment? I was starting to get a bit frustrated that he wasn't settling, right? If I'm being
Yeah,
really honest, like,
I love
also,
hearing that.
yeah, like so I doing anything wrong? No, but like let's recognize if I'm going to really reflect on like what I'm bringing to the table in that moment, not in a way that I'm trying to put a blame or a shame on it, but just in like a spirit of openness and really trying to understand it. If
And
I was be
recognition.
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, I was starting to get frustrated and some of the frustration is that okay, like a lot of the time I try and have a practitioner here working with him at the barn, it's always really busy. And like
Yeah.
people are coming and going, and I, can't put him in the cross ties where I want to. And like, it's just like, and he's already kind of hard to focus. And he used to be a horse that couldn't stand in cross ties because he pulled back or had done different things.
Mm.
So the fact that like he was able to focus and worked with us for like 4 hours that day and spent hours in a cross tie, is quite remarkable and is so indicative of how much, I think growth he's done. But I'm still also carrying all that other feels that I have,
Course, yeah, and
right?
how could you not, right?
And so I think like also um the very like human condition of like the past being the best predictor of the future, but also we grow and they grow and evolve and change, and sometimes you know, us meeting our horse where they're at. It's a
Mm,
balancing act of remembering all the things that brought them to where they were at, but also not being too stuck in the past. And I think that's a piece for me that has a lot of humility that I'm always trying to learn more and self reflect on because I see huge value in getting a little bit more proficient at that balancing act because it is
yeah,
really it is both and um they might come with a story, but they're not their story, and
yes.
you gotta be present, and
Mhm.
the best things come when you're 100% present.
True, yeah, and you know
Yeah.
what? I love that you said that because that moment was a really shining example of that because, he hadn't been out for too long at that point, maybe it had been, like, 40 minutes or something, and, we were kind of on the cusp of does he need to go back into the stall and have a break,
Yep.
or does he need something different? And so,
Yep.
even in testing that out, it was like, well, let's see what he communicates. If I give him a certain energy and open the door for this opportunity of, okay, we can stay here and settle and
Yep.
like be harmonious. And if that doesn't work, then that's okay. Like we can go into the stall, you can have a break, like whatever you need, we can
Yep.
make happen because we want it to be a positive experience for you. And it was funny because I remember saying to you, like, now, whatever it was, 40 minutes in with like 10 people suddenly in the barn, he's
Yeah.
quieter than he was when we started.
Yeah, he
Who
settled
is
in.
that? Because we thought he's getting to the end of his window of tolerance. Like we thought we were really pushing it when in fact, as soon as he had a little tool to help, so just
Mm.
someone to co-regulate with him and just like, whew, everything's fine. You're doing.
Yep.
He was just like, okay, that's cool. I can do this, and it was really nice because you could see this like calm confidence come over him. Where he's like, "Oh, I actually
Yeah.
don't need to move my feet, and I don't need to look at the other horses, and I don't need to worry about the other people, and I can suddenly be really present in this exchange." And that was really cool to see, because
Yeah.
where his history may have indicated, "Oh, well, he doesn't cross tie and you know,
And he doesn't
he's overwhelmed
stand
and
and
he's
yeah.
all these things." In actuality, where he is now and who he was showing up as that day, he wound up being totally fine to stand longer and, like, be an active but calm and happy
Mhm.
participant in the work that we continued to do, which was really cool.
Yeah, and I was really proud of him that day. He did so good. He was trying, but you could see that he settled in and was having such a good time, he didn't have to actively try as much, which is amazing. And I think the value of the co-regulation for him is really, really important. When I say he maybe needs a bit more leadership, for me, like that co-regulation is actually what that leadership means. Like, and that he needs that support to like help him
Mhm.
build confidence because he often is lacking in confidence,
Yeah.
being young, being new, and like having maybe had also a bunch of experiences that I don't really know what they were. We know
Mhm.
some of them were bad, but maybe he also had some other good ones, hard to say, really.
Yeah.
Right? We're guessing. And and how much do they matter in the moment, I think it's important and it's hopeful to remember what can be done in the moment. Also with the self-awareness, with the emotional regulation, with sometimes just taking a pause and taking a beat and having the
Mhm.
awareness to do that. Like, I think you
Absolutely.
modeled that for both of us in that moment, which was incredible. Because I think I had some people say, like, people are always kinda, like, watching and kinda, checking out. So I had a couple people be like, "Oh, like, I thought you were getting a saddle fitter, like, it looked like you were getting body work or something else done," and, and I'm kinda like, "Well, yeah," kind of like we did a whole variety of different things in the session,
Yeah.
and some energy work, and they were so impressed and, like,
Mhm.
so floored, and they were like, "Oh, like, I wish I knew she was coming." Like, that looked incredible because they also, they could see and feel it, being
Mhm.
there, like, how harmonious that was,
Yeah.
and they could see it in Regalo as well, right? And some of them have sensitive horses or fussy horses or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Horses that, don't like their saddles and all the things, and, and what I will say is that so all of that was incredible. And then you pulled out a saddle that is, your own brand of saddle, and you put it
Mhm.
on him. And we, as soon as it was on him, it was like, well, that actually looks pretty good. When we, one of the biggest chronic issues I've had with him is saddle slipping forward all the time. All the time, everything's slipping
Mhm.
forward because of his movement. He's really narrow in the front. He's got this really wide rib cage. The
Yeah.
girth comes
Wide
forward.
band.
Everything's like forward. And I said to you this, I was like, oh my gosh, I've had custom saddles that are moving all around on him. This saddle didn't slide forward without weight in it, without a crazy tight cinch or a bunch of other things, and like him kind of lunging and romping around. And just how impressed I was with that because it, up until that point, I've been told like that's not really ideal, but is expected somewhat,
Yeah.
right? Like you don't have any weight in the saddle. That's the
Yeah.
way he's built. That's the way he moves. So some slippage, some movement is normal.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, surely, like, is it? Like,
Yeah. Yeah,
right?
and
And
it's such a tricky
but but I'd
thing.
kind of gotten to that point where I'd had enough people tell me it that I was like, okay, like maybe I'm just, kind of out to lunch. And
Mm.
I remember you and I checking it after. And I was kind of like, did it slide forward a little bit? And I'm kind of looking at it and I'm not really sure. And you're like, well, not really. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it didn't. And I'm like, oh, it
Yeah.
didn't. Like, I just assumed it had because everything moved forward on him up until that point and was told that was normal. So, anyways, um, and like a logical part of me knows that that's not normal. But,
Yeah.
I'd kind of overwritten that because I'd had
Yes.
so much professional guidance that was also telling me that that's also kind of like we have to do the best we can, and he's just a really challenging fit, so this is the best that we can do. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
it's
again,
so hard because it's so often the narrative, right? And it's so often the reality. Like, that's one of the really frustrating things that I certainly struggle with as a saddle fitter and why I wanted to design and develop my own line of saddles is like, why is mediocre so often the best we can do? Like, come on. There's gotta be a better option, and mediocre at, like, a massive price point. I'm not talking, like,
yes.
mediocre for a small sum, like, we're talking mediocre for a huge amount of money, and, like, the last saddle you had, thinking this is gonna be infinitely adjustable and, the total fit and everything's going to be amazing. And like, what did it last 6 months? The trouble
Like,
is, like, that's not
not even.
yeah, so not even 6 months and, like, to the tune of how many thousands of dollars, like, it's wild how often that happens, and, I think in part we have to normalize that a little bit, that as horses are transforming in their bodies, even fully adjustable saddles, like, even our saddles with an interchangeable gullet that can adjust 6 tree sizes, that's not gonna fit every horse all the time, at all. Like, that is
Yeah.
not the reality of even adjustable saddles, but if we can
Mm,
start with something that's the right shape, the right size, the right configuration, because the other piece is you were not in balance in these other saddles. So then you're fighting that. And then you're fighting trainers that are like, well, it's your position. Your position is the problem, but not having the awareness. And I see this all the time, trainers that don't have the awareness around the
yeah.
importance of saddle fit for the rider as well as saddle fit for the horse. And the fact that, like, the
Mhm.
saddle is the interface between a rider's vertical spine and a horse's horizontal spine. And so if
Yeah.
that interface throws either the horse or the rider's balance off in any direction on any plane, right? Front, back, side, up, down,
Yeah.
um, you're constantly fighting that. And that
Yes.
fight creates a lack of harmony in the two bodies. So
Yeah. Intention.
always struggling. And exactly, you get tension either through us or through them
Yeah.
or through both of us. That's being,
Totally.
again, that's like the co-regulation piece. Like, we're tight in this rapport balance and the fact that our saddle's putting us in a bit of a chair seat and we're getting thrown to the cantle. And then we're constantly having to try and like correct that imbalance. Guess what?
Yeah.
They're then constantly having to correct their balance for us. And so I remember you also like sitting in the saddle and I was like, you're not chair seated at all. Like, your leg is in a perfect position. You're like, "Yeah," and I'm not even having to think about it, and it's like, yeah, that's kinda how it should be. You shouldn't have to be, like, forcing your body into the right position, and, when I saw you get in, I was like, "This does not look like a rider who struggles with her position, certainly not a rider who struggles with a chair seat," because you were just, like, perfectly aligned, and
Well, thank
that's
you.
something that makes a big difference as well. You're welcome, and it's just like it's amazing to see what a difference it makes when you get those pieces right. And when you
Yeah.
get the situation right, because yes, certainly on a lunge, a saddle with no weight will move more than a saddle with weight in it. And,
Yeah.
certain shapes and conformations of horses, you're going to see more movement. But at the end of the day, like if it's sliding up over their shoulders, that's not going to help anybody.
No.
It's kind of normalizing the fact that like sometimes we can do better. We just need to look harder at the problem
Yeah.
and try harder to find the right solution.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what we've been talking about also throughout the conversation is that like that balancing of, if we know better also
Mhm.
like, then we can do better and
Yes.
that but also sometimes that takes a little bit of nuance and it takes a bit of finessing and it takes a bit of creativity and takes a heck of a ton of patience and it takes support and it takes other
Yes. Oh my
skillful
gosh.
people, because like even for me, like I'm an adult amateur who grew up riding and kind of stepped away in my like early adult years and got back into it. And I'm not a professional rider or trainer. I'm someone who loves their horse and like wants
Mhm.
to be a really good rider. Um, but I appreciate I'm not a professional. So also if I'm sitting there and I had gotten to the point where like, yeah, a lot of the feedback I was receiving, it's like, oh, like it's just your position is bad. And I'm like, fair enough. My position, I'm always like, could always be better. I'm very open to that. And then the position is bad on him. And it's him. So he's green and your position is bad. And maybe the saddle's not great, but but it's part of the equation. But maybe if you could just get in a better position, you know, then this whole thing would go better.
Right.
And I was kinda sitting there like, I haven't had this many problems with my position and in, like, years. So, like, this is I've got lots of other issues I'm working on, but, like, position wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
So, I was kinda going like, "This doesn't really quite seem right," but also like, yeah, hey, maybe maybe I've really regressed. Maybe. but between like, yeah, having a different coach and like some other different people I'd connected with that were like, oh, 100% this saddle's a no-go. Being in something else, having a different experience, and also connecting with you and having a different experience, I was sort of like, okay, well, that's good. I
Your
just
position is not the problem. The saddle is the problem that's creating the position.
like, yeah, we'll still work on that, but maybe we're not like, okay, we can get in a decent position as long as we have a decent fitting saddle, and like you can still get into one in the poor fitting saddle ish, but
Yeah.
it's hard because you are, to your point, you're always fighting it.
Mm.
And when you also have a horse that's hypermobile underneath you,
Yes.
right? That like sometimes feels a bit like you're riding Gumby. And like there's just a lot of movement happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then you're trying to like get have a quiet mouth, right? While you're at it. Then it's just one too many things that aren't setting you or I think or the horse up for success in that moment. So it doesn't have to be
Yeah.
such a fight. So that was hugely, I think, yeah, I was like, I was a bit emotional by the time we even finished the session because I was like, just like I have so many feels and I care, so deeply about this horse and just want to
Yeah.
do the best for him. And like how amazing to also have such a great positive experience. Um,
Yeah.
was really awesome. And I'd like to say it happened more, but it really doesn't. So it was also notable for me,
Mm.
I think to make sure that you knew that because it was, it was really unique and really appreciated. Uh and then I was also just like, "Oh, like, Katrina's a gem." Like, we could
Oh,
we could talk about all the things
yeah.
and in fact, here we are talking about all the things,
All
some of
the
the things we've talked
things.
about and some new things.
Yeah, it's so true. Well, and I'm so, so grateful for that feedback. Thank you because, it makes my heart so happy to know like, hey, the way you showed up even and the fact that you listened and, cared made a really big difference. Because I think so often what I see for people is it's hard to feel like anyone cares and it's hard to feel like anyone has the answers and it's hard to feel like we have the help that we need. And having the right allies on that journey can make such a massive difference for us and for our horses. And I feel like I've kept you for so long, Caitlin, but I would love to know, in closing, what are, some of the things that maybe you've learned that wish other riders could hear as they kind of go through their journey so they don't feel so alone.
Yeah, and, that's that experience of not feeling so alone and feeling seen and feeling heard and feeling supported and having my horse feel like obviously supported through the session. I was so grateful to have that interaction, that very relational, human centered interaction with you. And, that's the reason why doing this podcast even, really was interesting to me is that how important it is, I think, to have community and to
Yeah.
have support. Because a lot of these pieces are really complex and it isn't so binary. And I don't think there is just a one size fits all for all horses, or just because we've always been doing it this way, we should keep on doing it this way. Or just because it worked for your last horse doesn't mean it's going to work for your new horse.
Mhm.
And you're not the same person as you were then either. So maybe what works for you has shifted and that's okay. So maybe it's some comfort with some movement, but
Mhm.
also how important it is to surround yourself with with some people that that have your back and that you feel
Mhm.
supported by, and that confidence, I think, as equestrians, and that supportiveness to not always have all the right answers and to
Mhm.
ask for help or to try a few different ways, and for people to understand and support that journey is invaluable. So I think as equestrians, as much as we can give ourselves some of that own permission is, important, but I think when and where possible, when we can support others, professionals or other equestrians, in the community who people who love horses in providing that kind of space for exploration and for support,
Yeah.
I guess my kind of call to action is to do that for each other, as much as possible, because I think also when we are like healthy and well and supported and feel like we can be a bit exploratory, I guess, and a bit creative, and
Mhm.
we can listen to our horses, and we are supported to listen to our horses by our community around us,
Yeah.
I think we're all just going to end up in a better place. But I think we're also going to do better as stewards for our horses. And as you mentioned,
Mhm.
think about that partnership. What are we bringing to the table? I think
Yes.
that's part of the equation that we can help show value for our horses by being better guardians and better partners, and showing up and listening
Yeah.
and looking to solution with them, not always just for them. So I think those are the pieces that I've learned the most about lately, and those are the pieces I've been thinking about the most, since we've met, and what I'm gonna do different and what I'm willing to change and what I'm already doing different with Regalo on a day to day. Mm, it's feeling better and it's looking better and the relaxation is going up and the tension is going down. And
Mm.
to me that tells us that we're on the right path.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just so excited for you guys and to see where you go from here because really, like a year in, you're still at the beginning of your journey and yet you've already come so far, and
Yeah.
for all the listeners, like watching you guys work together, the relationship they have, you can see is so strong and he is just like so in tune with you. And you can tell that
Yeah.
that's come from the love and care that you've given him and the
You make
fact
me
that
emotional about it. But
yeah,
yeah.
but it was really beautiful when I saw you
Yeah.
guys working together and I was just like, "Oh, this is so cool." It's really beautiful to see because that horse in the wrong hands, it would go really, really, really poorly. I think it's a beautiful testament to you and your openness to learning and meeting him where he's at and growing as a horsewoman that you've come as far as you have in a short period of time with a horse that has some really dynamic needs and who is very sensitive and could so easily pull you into one thing or another in terms of how you're showing up. And I feel like the consistency, even obviously, none of us are ever perfect in the way we show up, but
Yeah.
your dedication to showing up for him, it really, really shows. And the authenticity and integrity with which you're doing it is really admirable. So thank you for
Well, thank
sharing.
you.
Thank you for
Means a
coming
lot
on
to
the
me.
podcast and sharing your story.
Being unbridled.
Yes, exactly. That's what it's all about, you know?
Yeah.
Because again, if we think about the shame, I'm obsessed, in case everybody hasn't noticed. I'm obsessed with this podcast that Warwick Schiller just put out, and I had sent it to Caitlin
It's
as well,
incredible.
just because I was blown away by the implications that were outlined of how shame really dictates so much of who we become and how we behave and how we interact and how we think about ourselves and how we think about others in society as a whole. And then obviously, of course, I'm looking at it through the lens of the horse world as well. But I want more people to be unbridled and to be unabashedly themselves and to approach their horses with this curiosity and this sense of, hey, what are we not seeing? What are we not hearing?
Yeah.
And how can we be better? How can we show up differently? So thank you for sharing your story, Caitlin. And I can't wait to have you back to have some deeper conversations about some of the other really cool things we talked about, sort of leadership frameworks and barn dynamics and the energetics of that and how horses pick up on it. I feel like I said this to Caitlin previously, I wish so badly that I had recorded our phone conversation the other day because I feel like we touched on just about everything you could possibly imagine. And it was the most
Oh,
enlightening, enlivening conversation I've had in so long. And I was just absolutely blown away by some of the things that we touched on. And I'm like, you acknowledged like we're just brushing the surface of so many of them. So,
Yeah.
and today was really just like a little intro about you and, some of the horse dynamics, but I can't wait to chat
Yeah.
more. So thank you
Me
for your
too.
time and for sharing your story and Regalo's story with us today, Caitlin. That was wonderful.
Thanks for all your help and having me on. It's been a
Yeah.
pleasure to chat to you, and yeah,
Likewise.
look forward to doing more of it.
Yes, me too. Okay, well, thank you, thank you, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful night.
Yeah, you too. I was just thinking, I'm like, "Oh, it's actually getting a little bit darker
A
now."
little
So,
dark, I know. It's
yeah,
starting to get dark
hopefully
so
it's not too
early.
dark with the filming, so
Oh, I think it
and you
looks
can edit
great.
all the rest of this out, but yeah, I hope this gave you, also, like, yeah, like, just, is is what you were hoping for, if that's possible. I feel like you came in pretty open, but I
Yeah,
just
no, I
really
think it looks
enjoyed the
great.
conversation and spending time with you, and oh my gosh, time melts when you're having a good time.
It
It
sure
truly
does.
does.
It really, really does. Yeah, but
Yeah,
this is fabulous. So thank you for
yeah,
everything. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and I can't.
yeah, this is fun.
Yeah.
Top filling and meaningful and really enjoyable all at once.
Yeah, I
And
totally agree.
yeah, I think that's another thing to talk about some more is like some of like I'd love to talk more with you about like the fun and the energetics and
Yeah.
so many of those other pieces also of knowledge that you bring and how skilled you are, and how willing I think that you are to share some of that knowledge that is so beneficial for the rest of us too is really cool. So yeah, I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate you, Katrina. You're really good people.
Aw, thank you. Likewise, darling. Seriously, I'm so glad that we met, and I know that it
Me
was
too.
totally meant to be because you
It
just
just
seem like
all fell into place.
yeah, I really, really did, and I'm so grateful
Yeah,
for
me too. Me too.
that. Fabulous.
Well, have a
Okay.
good evening. Have fun
You
with your
too.
doggo if you guys get outside or enjoy the last of this of
I
the warm
know,
light
and
in the
it turned
sky.
out to be such a nice day, like, it was
Oh,
so
yeah.
interesting because it was so yucky earlier.
I know.